Welcome to Brand Vat. We are delighted to be rejoined by Jacob Bauer, who has just produced a wonderful book on effective altruism. Jacob, would you like to start with a thought experiment?
So imagine you were given $1 billion with strings attached. You have to allocate that money exclusively towards addressing world problems. So the big question, well, how do you distribute this funding? And well, why? What criteria or considerations guide your decision making? What principles should you follow in how you distribute this funding?
Okay, so I take it that the majority of people would donate money to the kind of causes that they already donate to, which are causes that align with their values or they align with a feel-good element. So giving to, for example, a cattery, if they love cats, or a puppy home if they love dogs, or giving to a fund for child welfare if they have children and they feel strongly about the importance of children. So I assume people would donate to what feels good for them and what they resonate with. And I'm guessing you're going to tell me why they shouldn't do this.
Well, I'm not going to necessarily tell you shouldn't do any of that, but the effective altruist approach in general is trying to combine the head and the heart. If you have altruistic feelings that you want to improve the world, how do you do so most intelligently as possible? How do we actually be effective with that? So if at least some of your goals are to make the world a better place, it seems like we should be looking to evidence and reason to try to figure out where exactly to devote our limited time and resources. And in terms of this case, you have a large amount of resource. If your goal is to make yourself feel better and make you feel as good as possible, well, maybe then you go to whatever place is going to make you feel good donating to. Maybe those are things that have personally touched you in the past. But if your goal is to make the world a better place and perhaps be able to use this money to improve the world as much as possible, or at least that's a portion of your goal, you might want to think a bit more carefully about where exactly you are putting this funding.
So, one response someone might have is to think about the world and think about where are those places in the world where charity is the least needed. And so they might think about the nation states that are very prosperous and the systems that they have in place to ensure prosperity for their citizens versus the places where people live in despair and squalor. And think that instead of donating money, what we ought to do is try and replicate those state structures that have succeeded. And the states that have succeeded tend to be, let's say, free market capitalist places, places that embrace the rule of law, that have strong institutional structures, that treat citizens with some level of freedom, dignity, and equality. And those places where you have much despair or where you have, you know, corruption and deceit and maladministration. Also, the kinds of places where the charitable money that could be sent there could very well be misused. And so you might think that the way to improve the lot of people is not to engage in charitable efforts, but rather to engage in some kind of regime change.
Yeah, so I hear this response a lot, actually, in terms of the traditional effective altruism approach, which is targeting areas that perhaps charitable organizations that could address big issues the most. And often will cite things like Against Malaria Foundation or place other areas that will improve the lives of the most impoverished people on the planet. But maybe the best way to improve the world is through larger systemic structural changes or maybe regime change. And I think that is a possibility. I think one of the big issues with that approach, though, is just how do you actually do so effectively? What ways? What's your theory of change? In essence, like, is this $1 billion perhaps going to have a regime change or a system change that will actually improve the world? And one of the difficult issues in terms of regime change is that it doesn't always end up being better for the people. It can actually cause more disruption and end up harming the most underprivileged people on the planet, or the people that the very thing that you're trying to address, perhaps in an area of certain injustices. Perhaps if you putting a bunch of money there, you're probably going to be an outside influencer. That money is going to be branded in a certain way, And then maybe even if it does start a revolution or what have you, it's uncertain whether it's actually going to improve the end results afterwards. But then how do we? What principles should we follow? Effective altruists, they tend to give a certain framework to think, at least guidelines to help you think through these issues. And one way you can call it is the S&S framework: scale, neglectedness, solvability. It's also sometimes called the INT framework: importantness, in neglectedness, and solvability. It goes by like lots of different names in effective altruist circles. But the basics is that, well, how big is the problem that you're trying to address? That's for scale or importance. Neglectedness is how much attention and resources are currently directed towards addressing that problem currently. And the idea there is that, well, if it's something that nobody's addressing, there's perhaps a lot of low-hanging fruit, things that if you go in there and start addressing it now, be able to push things along more so than perhaps something that already a bunch of people are working on. But then the big one is solvability. Now, how much will this $1 billion or whatever hundreds of millions of dollars of this $1 billion pool you're spending on, what will it likely do? Will it actually make a difference? Will it lead to new solutions or expand existing ones?
So one problem that seems to pop to mind is, how do you measure this? So how would you measure, firstly, how big the problem is, how much attention it's getting, and what your return on happiness investment is? So how do you measure your return?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the big issues in this an area of development in general, is how exactly do you measure this? I'm not a social scientist, so I'm not as well versed in their methods for doing this. I just know that they do have some to get at least some estimates. And I guess the big thing is having some way to measure, even if they're not fine-tuned measurements, having some sense of scale can be helpful in making these determinations. I think very often a common objection to this line of thinking is like, oh, well, we can't have fine-tuned measurements, and so we shouldn't do it at all. But I think there's at least some use to get a sense of scale, a sense of how big is the issue and how big are the things that we could actually do with this money if we're successful, in when we're making these type of difficult trade-offs in terms of how to allocate our resources.
So you can imagine a couple of different ways in which it'd be good to be effective. The one is, let's say you're picking between two charities that have the same aim, and the one is just much better at achieving that aim than the other. So you're picking between animal welfare shelters, and the one is just incredibly inefficiently run and does a very poor job of, preventing suffering or saving animals' lives, and the other one is, run like Doge, and so all the little Doge puppies get treated very well, and you get good bang for your buck. And so that seems like you ought to prioritize the effective one, all things being equal. Maybe there's some good case for why you would, hand money off to the less efficient charity, like it's run by, your close friends and family or something, and you think that supporting them matters too. And the other one is in the particular thing that you support. So I suppose the one worry is that if we're trying to maximize the good, that there are certain causes that will always be left behind, on the basis that you can get the most bang for your buck with certain kinds of interventions. And so if I think about an organization like GiveWell, they prioritize certain things like malaria nets. I said it's very cheap to buy malaria nets. You can save a lot of lives. Deworming pills. They used to allocate a dollar value to a life. They would be put like this: X many dollars will yield to this number of people being saved. They had a kind of calculation for that. Now, I gather one of the difficulties is that that number has shifted over time, that some of the things that they thought were efficacious turned out to be less efficacious than expected. And maybe that's okay. Maybe it's all right to say, well, we're aiming in the right direction, and we'll just revise our beliefs like we would with any other sort of scientific endeavor. But it has sort of left some level of crisis when people feel like, why should I trust these guys who've got a kind of hard-nosed utilitarian approach when they seem to get it wrong all the time?
Yeah, I guess the nice thing about GiveWell in particular is they're very transparent, and they do each year give updates on here's where we're thinking are our top charities. But they also have different funds you can now give to as well. But they usually give a list of like top 4 or top 3 charities. It looks like right now it's top 4, and often it's preventing malaria in various ways, vitamin deficiency, and vaccines. Or it looks like those are their top ones that they're looking at today. And yeah, they update those dollar values over time where they think that are their best guesses in terms of how much money it would take additional funding that they get. They'll be able to save this many more lives. But they also have a whole corner of their website on our mistakes. And they're trying to just do their best at this project of using evidence of reason and even in randomized control trials, and trying to look at what are the most evidence-backed ways that you can make a difference with your donations. And I think that's a pretty noble goal, even though the reality is, yeah, we're doing our best, but these are all estimates. And I guess related to this, there's another one that isn't on their top recommended charity list, but one that they actually still praise quite a bit, and that's Give Directly, where you can choose to give money that goes directly, at least minus transfer costs, to the poorest people in the world. And they actually kind of use that as their baseline in terms of, like, at the very least, what you could be doing is giving $1,000 perhaps to someone who's making less than $700 a year, living in extreme poverty, in terms of, and that's adjusted for purchase power parity in the United States is usually the metric that they use. And that's going to do a lot more good than perhaps giving it to a local charity, perhaps giving more. Well, if your goal is to perhaps provide more nutrition for people, you could donate to your local soup kitchen. But that amount of money that would increase the amount of people saving people's lives in at least my corner of the world is going to be astronomically large in terms of what's actually going to save a person's life in my community. Whereas doubling someone's income in the poorest places in the world, I can see how that's going to do a lot more good over there. But they use that kind of as a baseline to say, well, at the very least, that's what we could do. But are there charities that we have enough evidence behind them to justify them being much better than this? And I heard them in some conferences, some of the researchers there talk about their basic benchmark is, before they recommend, they're looking, put them on their top recommendation list, are those that are 10 times effective. And those are things that, well, like providing vaccines or providing essential vitamins that people wouldn't have access to, even if perhaps they have more money. If they don't have a place to purchase these or aren't aware that these are things that they need, they might not have access to them. And I think as long as you're going through this earnestly and really trying to assess the evidence and really trying to figure out where your mistakes are in the past, this is a type of research project that's important and one that can hopefully help direct more dollars to areas that can improve the world.
So 2 questions, Jacob. The one question is more politically correct than the other. So the politically correct question would be, is this an obligation? Do you have an obligation to give to the best option? Or is this just super arbitrary, something that you can do? It'd be very nice of you to do it. But the obligation falls short of that. You have to give some, but not all of your money. You have to give it all of it, but not necessarily to the best option. Where does obligation lie? That's the first question. The less politically correct question is it always the case that saving lives is the most optimal way of measuring effectiveness? So if you were to give your money to the people who are the poorest on earth, perhaps what you're doing is you're extending a very unhappy life. If you were to give the money to someone who is poor, but not the poorest on earth, and that extra money would catapult them into a new level of happiness, not into just a prolonged unhappy life, perhaps instead of having more unhappy people continuing in life, you would have suddenly an unhappy person who's converted from unhappy to happy. And you've got a better future. So why should we count that as the measure of an effective mechanism?
Yeah, I guess on a broader response in terms of for the effective altruism community at large is that this is current debates that they're having as well. Like if you're really trying to figure out what's going to improve the world the most, is saving lives the best metric? Is perhaps we should be thinking more on promoting happiness, or maybe there's other aspects that makes a life go better, makes the world better that we should be thinking of. And so on one level, I think this is the part of the project of if you want to improve the world, trying to figure out, well, what ways actually benefit the world. But I think at least thinking of the cases of the area of effective altruism that's focusing on global development of the poor and trying to improve the lives of the poorest people on the planet, I think it sets a baseline, at least, saying, look, at the very least, this seems to be, we have pretty good evidence to say that around $3,000 to $5,000, let's say, donating to these types of charities that are well vetted and we have good evidence behind them seems to be at least saving lives or improving lives, or perhaps some promote organizations like the Seva Foundation, which $20 to $50 can cure people of blindness. That wouldn't have expand their services so that more people will have the gift of sight than they would have otherwise. And so seems to be at least a baseline of good that we could be doing with our resources. But that doesn't mean that that's the only way that we could be doing good. And in the effective altruism community, the views on this are diverse. And so the most famous area that effective altruists work on is global development of combating extreme poverty in the world. But it's not the only one. There's two other main camps, I think, is using that scale, neglectedness, solvability framework that effective altruists tend to work on. One is animal issues, and especially factory farming, where we have hundreds of billions of animals living, land animals. If we count factory farm fish, we're in the trillions. So the scale is huge in terms of animals in these factory farming conditions. But they are, and if you know anything about those conditions, they're terrible. If animals can suffer, they are living lives of suffering and then being killed, often in painful manners, all for the sake of, our food and animal products. And so this is something that's only increasing over time. So something that's large in scale, relatively neglected in the sense that only a small percentage of people really know about it or maybe or really care about it at all. And then in terms of solvability, well, we know certain ways that could actually address these issues, certain things that can help turn the tide on those issues. And so some will say, well, no, actually the biggest thing that we should be focusing on are these billions of animals that are living lives of suffering due to our wanting cheap animal products, essentially. And so that's the second category. So we have combating extreme poverty, a big one, in a variety of different ways, by the way. It's not, and there's many different avenues that effective altruists are looking at each of these things. But then there's animal suffering, especially in factory farms. Then the last big group is reducing catastrophic risks. So things like pandemics, nuclear war, and potential catastrophic outcomes through AI or climate change even. And so catastrophic risks are obviously huge in scale, the largest scale you can think of. That could be wiping out all life on planet in some cases. Neglectedness, now there's some debate there in terms of how neglected certain catastrophic risks are. But then there is the solvability aspect. And that's where I think the main disagreement in the effective altruism community lies, where there's a large camp that are saying, well, no, this is the biggest thing that we should be focusing on because of how large a scale it is. And not only does it affect people alive today, but all future generations as well. Whereas many others saying, well, look, that's nice if we could do something about it, but how solvable is it? How can we be to actually make a change there? Whereas there's these other things that we have a lot of evidence that we actually can improve the world, that more money going to these areas will actually result in people living better lives. And so I guess the short answer to your question is like, yeah, this is a big question. and there's a lot of disagreement within the effective altruism community over it. And it's a continuing project in trying to evaluate how exactly to benefit the world the most with your resources.
So just to push my first question, given how difficult it is to assess these different courses of action, which where does your obligation lie? How can we be obligated to perform the right action when we don't know what that is?
Yeah. So I guess it's, once again, it's this there's uncertainty there, but it's not complete uncertainty. Like, we do have a good sense that it's money in certain areas will result in good things happening, like fewer people contracting malaria, or fewer people contracting a lot of other diseases in terms of expanding vaccines, or fewer people being blind, or more people getting their eyesight back. And so there are certain areas that, sure, there's always some level of uncertainty with these things, but we do have now over a decade worth of evidence being compiled by organizations such as GiveWell and others. Open Philanthropy is another one that does a lot of this research as well. And so it's not like we don't know anything about this, but if the question is, all right, now if we do some of our research, we look into these organizations, we look at all the different studies that they post, or at least a handful of them, and start gaining some confidence. All right, at the very least, I could be donating 10% of my income, or a certain percentage of my income, and save X amount of lives throughout my career. And so then the question is, are you obligated to be giving to these high impact charities? Or is it okay to give just to whatever, once again, what makes you feel good? Now, the charities that hit home perhaps more, that when you give to them, when you see those commercials, or perhaps whenever someone talks to you about it, like, or so maybe something's bad happened in your past, a family member dies of cancer or something like that, and so you feel drawn, I should donate my money here to try to cure cancer, rather than perhaps give to these organizations that are, well, more reliably going to save a life. What's our moral obligation here? Now, once again, effective altruism, diverse movement. There's a spectrum of views on this. And you can go on one side of things, arguably the moral inspiration for effective altruism, one of the most well-known effective altruists out there, Peter Singer. He famously argues that we do have strong moral obligations to sacrifice our luxuries for the sake of saving people's lives or dramatically improving the lives of others. He gives this famous thought experiment of, if you walk by a pond and there's a toddler drowning in it, you could easily step in that pond, ruin your shoes and pants, but save that child's life. Most people say, yeah, you absolutely, you are morally obligated to do that. And in fact, if you just walked by and said, you know what, I really like my shoes and these are my favorite pants, you'd be putting the value of your objects, your luxuries, over the value of something that has intrinsic significance, a life of another. And so if we take that analogy to the extent, while we do seem to be living in a world where we can give a certain percentage, or perhaps all of our luxuries, live in maybe in a sense, voluntary poverty, could be giving all that extra money to these organizations, which we have reliable evidence does improve the lives of people by a huge margin, and potentially save many people's lives in the process. Well, then perhaps on a moral level, we should be doing that. Now, on a psychological level, he acknowledges that most people aren't able to live in voluntary poverty. He doesn't himself, although he gives the vast majority of his wealth to these charities. But nonetheless, he thinks that as on one level, a moral failure, but on another level, if you're giving more than the average individual and you're actually doing something about this, he also says that's still, even though maybe you should be, on an ideal sense, be doing more, that's still praiseworthy, because you're still doing something that most other people aren't doing. You're still at least doing something. And so I think even for those that are on have a strong sense that we have a moral obligation to do something, still take a tone of, look, it's not all or nothing. Just because you can't bring yourself perhaps to live in voluntary poverty and give all that you can to these organizations doesn't perhaps mean that you should just do nothing at all. And it's actually his recommendations these days, in his most recent edition of The Life You Can Save, he actually recommends starting out in as low as 1%, depending on, he has this graduated of income bracket where the more you make, the more that you could start with. But it basically says, look, start with giving an amount that you're not going to miss. You're still going to be living in one of the richest lifestyles ever on the planet, but also in human history. And you'll also be doing some good with some extra money as well. And maybe over time you can work on, well, perhaps giving more. So I think on a theoretical level, there's a case that we have strong moral obligations to be giving to these organizations because we have reliable information that they're actually going to be doing such good in the world. But even those making that argument say, well, look, it's better to start somewhere. And so perhaps it'd be still morally praiseworthy for you to at least start doing something about these large global issues rather than nothing.
So I'm wondering how partial we're entitled to be. So you've mentioned a couple of categories of interest. So let's say there's the human beings in your family, the human beings in your country, there's human beings in other countries, then you've got animal welfare, and then you've got future persons who don't yet exist. Now, you could use some neutral method, which is like head-ons or utils or pain and pleasure, something like that, to sort of work it out. And you say, well, we don't differentiate based on, arbitrary grounds like citizenship or, whether you happen to be a non-human animal or a human animal. And you could take the same view about future human beings, say just because you don't exist yet doesn't mean that we shouldn't take your interest into account. Or you could do some discounting. So you could apply some kind of formula to say, well, if you live in another country, depending on how far away it is, we discount your interests accordingly. Or you could have some kind of like lexical priority, where you just say, whenever these two interests clash, we pick the one group over the other. How should the effective altruists navigate those things?
Yeah. So just like with all these answers, I'm going to say the reality is there's a diverse set of views. And what my book focuses on is offering what are some tools that effective altruists give to help us think through these difficult questions. Because rather than giving, here's a list of answers, it's more of here are, in good philosophical fashion, here are a list of considerations that perhaps can help us in figuring out these difficult problems. And a couple tools that I mentioned in chapter 3, where I talk about the issue of animals in particular, because I think this is the most controversial of those 3 categories of helping the global poor, animals, but then catastrophic risks. There's a lot of people that say, well, why should we care about animals at all? So perhaps depending on how much weight you give to the lives of animals or the suffering of animals might say whether you think this is a big global problem at all. And one of the key tools here that some effective altruists promote is called maximize expected choice worthiness. So this is related to a similar concept of expected value. We're trying to think of, well, what is the value that could be had here? Weigh it by the percentage, the likelihood of obtaining that value, and perhaps that's the way that we should be directing our time and resources. Maximize expected choice worthiness tries to leave the door open for other concepts of value as well, and also other concepts of good and bad, not just kind of classic utilitarian models. And so here you kind of think through, well, perhaps you lean utilitarian, and maybe you lean a hedonist, and you think that, at the very least, happiness matters a lot, and avoiding pain matters a lot. But maybe there are other things that matter too, that have value. And perhaps we should be including that as a possibility, at least, in thinking when we're weighing our decisions. And sure, there's another rival approach to this called just my favorite theory. And I think this is the approach that most people take on these difficult issues. It's like, well, this is the theory of the good life or things that matter that most resonates with me, or this is the theory of ethics that I think is most plausible. And so I'm just going to go all in. And that's the way I'm going to live my life. And that's the way that I'm going to make my donations or not make donations. Or this is how I'm going to use my career or your time on any particular issue. And that comes along with dangers, especially in the area of ethics where things are uncertain. I think we are making progress on ethics, but we definitely don't have a single agreed upon moral theory. And in certain cases, they come to very different conclusions. Once again, on the animal issue. In some cases, some like Kant and many other classic moral thinkers, gave no moral value to the lives of animals. And so if you're devoting your time and resources towards saving the lives of animals, you're risking just doing nothing, you're not improving the world at all. Whereas many others, including modern Kantians, such as more recently Tom Reagan, view, well, maybe animals do have moral worth. And if they do, how likely is it that they do or not? I guess the big question is we still don't know for sure. And so based upon are you 100% certain that these individuals have zero moral worth? Or is that at least plausible? And so maybe we should at least have some moral caution on some of these issues and not at the very least try to avoid potential moral catastrophes if you're wrong. And I think this is another issue of where it seems simple at first, but when we start getting into the details, if we're really concerned about making the world a better place, we have to grapple with the moral uncertainties out there and look for ways that help us walk through it.
So one important question is, how far ahead should we think? So should we think about the well-being of people today, in a week, in a year, in a millennium? And so one of my pet views is that if you had $1 billion, what you should do is put it towards promoting climate change. So you should increase climate change, for the reason being that if you do that, that's the best mechanism for driving humanity off the planet before there be a catastrophe that wipes out humanity. Whereas if you don't have something driving humanity off planet, we're going to slowly drown in our own excrement until a comet or a pandemic or some sort of horrendous cataclysm happens and humanity ends. So you might want to introduce short-term suffering in order to promote long-term flourishing.
So there's a concept among effective altruism circles and rationalist circles called S-risk, suffering risk. And so you're kind of combining a couple of concepts. And there's also a concept of X-risk, of existential risk, of risk that could cause extinction, among other things. And so it sounds like, all right, well, maybe if we expect a long run of society, of humanity to have a lot of suffering. And so if we live longer, just that's going to mean more drudgery, more suffering for the world. So maybe it's better to end things quickly. And so that way we get rid of that potential future suffering. Is that what you're suggesting?
So I find that view, because it's so bizarre, very attractive. But that's not actually my view. My view is I want humanity to persist through time. So I'm taking the opposite stance, that humanity should persist through time, but that humanity will die off eventually if it remains on this planet. And so you have to drive humanity off the planet as quickly as possible so that it can spread through the solar system and beyond. And that won't happen if you keep greenifying the earth. If you reduce climate change impacts, if you make the earth more habitable, we'll have no motivation to get off planet in the numbers and with the financial push that we need. And so what you want is a slow burn that lights a candle under us and gets us moving in the right direction. And climate change is a fantastic mechanism for that. It's not a cataclysm. It produces lots of unpalatable side effects, but not unpalatable enough that there's civilization ending immediately. And so it takes a lot of time for it to happen. I mean, I don't buy into the views that climate change will end civilization in 50 years. And it's going to take a lot longer than that. But we might want to accelerate it a bit so that it's more present in our daily lives, so that we have motivation to get off planet sooner.
So you're saying having something like climate change makes it more likely for us to be a perhaps interstellar species or spread across the galaxy rather than just be in our home planet. And so if we have something like climate change, that gives us some incentive to get off this planet sooner rather than later and start making other habitats elsewhere.
And the long-term benefits of that are significant, right? So it's infinite generations going forward of human lives versus our species slowly dying on this planet.
Faster or at all. I mean, I think human beings have a natural exploration instinct. And so I don't think climate change or no climate change would limit us from ever going out to the stars. But I guess the question is, it going to help us get an extra motivation to get there quicker? My only issue with that is that if we can solve the climate issues on other planets, we can solve climate change. Like Mars is not a habitable planet by any degree compared to any portion of Earth. And so if we can fix the planet of Mars, we can fix the planet of Earth. And so I get the general argument, I guess. Maybe there's other things that can make us more likely to start this spread across the galaxy quicker. I'm not exactly sure if climate change necessarily does that, except maybe in the sense that it just gives us this sense of, oh, well, we need a plan B, or we need a planet B.
Yeah, I'll just say two things. So the one is, I think climate change might be a good candidate for it. So I'm currently in Bangkok, and just the pollution is horrendous. And what's very interesting is that the population renewal rate in Thailand has now dropped to 1.0, which is lower than Japan and South Korea. And the primary reason cited is the air pollution. So it really does seem to impact people's view of the future. And that's not a far stretch from, let's get off planet. But let's put aside the question empirically of whether climate change can fulfill this mechanism. My question really is it okay to do short-term damage to promote long-term gains?
Yeah, I think the general effective altruist advice from the main effective altruist organization is to say, well, avoid that when possible. Now, there are certain cases where, like, what are we talking about? At what scale? If you give someone a vaccine, a shot, I mean, there is a certain damage on your arm, right? But for the benefit of getting a vaccine. But should you force those vaccines on people? Should we go against their consent? Well, because for the greater good. And that's where I think the work on moral uncertainty and thinking of things beyond just utilitarianism. There are many just straight consequentialists, consequentialists in the effective altruism movement. It makes sense because effective altruism is focusing on trying to benefit the world the most. But many will say that if we really want to make the world a better place, we should maybe have some moral caution in play. And this even goes back to the early days of utilitarianism with John Stuart Mill. He, as a utilitarian, advocated for strong protections of rights. In fact, in some cases, stronger protections of things like freedom of speech and bodily autonomy and things like that than many people today would argue for. But he was doing so on the grounds of utilitarianism, in the sense that actually having some pretty strong rules in place can prevent us from making mistakes. And it's very easy for us to rationalize that things are going to make the world better if by breaking certain rules in the moment, when in reality they won't. But that, on a theoretical level, the question is still there. Is it, in principle, if all the variables are controlled for, okay to have a certain amount of harm to others in order to, for the sake of the greater good? I think there has to be at least some sense, like the shot example, we are okay with a certain level of harm, especially if people consent to it, for the sake of long-term benefit. But then the question, well, where do we draw that line? And I think the general, once again, effective altruism take on that is to say, well, respect rights, don't do things that are generally considered as morally corrupt, even for the sake of benefiting the masses, because of moral uncertainty on two levels. One, maybe you should have a certain level of uncertainty in the real world that this will actually play out the way that you think it will. Those rules are put in place for a reason. But on another level, maybe there are things that matter more than impact. For effective altruism, to be an effective altruist, you have to care about making the world a better place to some degree. But maybe there's other things that matter too. And so maybe you should at least put some weight on those other factors as well. And so perhaps try to do the most good you can within normal moral constraints.
So I've got two questions. The one is whether we owe obligations at all to people who don't yet exist, and how far in the future should we think? So it seems that with short-term interventions, we can have a higher degree of certainty that our interventions will be efficacious than with interventions that, let's say, affect generations, hundreds or thousands of years in the future. One way of illustrating that is to think about how much weight would we put on the decisions of our ancestors from 500 years ago when they were thinking about the problems of today and how they could help us. It's unlikely that they would be able to envision the kind of world that we live in, and many of the interventions that they would have come up with wouldn't have been efficacious at all.
Yeah, so this gets us to this other area of effective altruism that's been gaining some prominence in recent years, called long-termism. So there's a whole group of effective altruists that say, well, the best thing that we can do for the world is ensure the long-term future is good for, well, I guess for future generations, that the future is long, but also good. So it's not a long future of suffering. It's a long future of thriving. But this is one of the key questions why there's such division in the movement, is that some will say, well, no, we need to focus on what's here now, what we know we can do. Whereas if we're focusing on future generations, which could be, sure, hundreds of billions of people, maybe trillions of people if we end up going out to the stars, and the amount of people living in our future could be unfathomable. But how well can we actually predict that we can actually affect those future generations? Now, William McCaskill, one of the founders of the movement, has a book called What We Owe the Future, where he kind of sketch out some of those ideas. And there's really different levels of long-termism. Like on one level, if there's something that we can do that perhaps, well, if someone can prevent a nuclear war, and the scary thing is that it seems like individuals have done that in the past and in our own history, that seems like a pretty good thing for future generations. That we've potentially, maybe it wouldn't have been a mass extinction, but that would have been a huge setback for generations and lots of suffering over time. So it seems like maybe there are some things that we can do to affect the lives of future generations, but should we give the lives of future generations more weight when there's people suffering right in front of us? So according to William McCaskill, long-termism is rooted in three central claims: that we have the ability to affect the lives of future generations. And that's one of the questions, like, well, it seems clear that we can, at least in some cases, do that, but how much and is that really practical to focus on? It's kind of one of the big questions of the movement. But then another key principle of long-termism is that future lives matter. And that's another thing that is up for debate. But one other aspect there as well is thinking of the long-term future. If we are able to survive as a species for even the next 1,000 years, so maybe we make it to year 3,000, we probably will have more people in our future than has ever existed in our 200,000 to 300,000 year existence as a species already. So as long as we can continue to survive just a little bit longer, we probably have more people living in the future. So then once again, the question is, but should we consider those lives in our moral calculations? And I have a thought experiment that I used in a book that I came up for the book that help us at least get at this intuition that we should maybe care for the future, at least to some extent. And this is, I call it a time capsule thought experiment. So imagine a school decides to create a time capsule to set to be opened in 100 years. And the teachers tell students, hey, include anything that you think will bring joy to future people. And the capsule is filled in with creative objects meant to, hey, make future people happy and maybe have a better understanding of our current time period. Now, 100 years from now, we can reasonably expect, nobody alive today will be benefiting from it, or at least nobody, that is contributing to this here. And if we wanted to maybe push it a little bit further to make sure, maybe 150 years or what have you. So this is purely just for the sake of future people. So on one level, people say, hey, this seems like a pretty good thing to do. It's a nice thing to do, but hey, it's not affecting anybody happening right now. But now imagine that we have some troubled, say, chemistry teacher who secretly rigs an explosive inside that time capsule. Now, he's very careful and meticulous. He would never harm anybody that's alive today. He really cares about people that are alive today. But you know what? Future people don't exist. They, at least right now. And he, gains great joy at the thought of harming future people and that he will never meet. And he said, well, he doesn't care at all for future people. He only cares about people right now. So might as well do something that will bring him joy. So he carefully designs an explosive only to detonate decades later, a century later, and make sure that there's no real risk of exploding. Now, maybe it's some slow chemistry thing that takes decades to actually make the transformation for it to be a bomb. So 100 years from now, people open the time capsule, start digging through it and having fun, and then all of a sudden they get to this box and it blows everybody up. That is the next to it. Now, I think most people would say that's terrible. What a profoundly unethical thing for the person to do. But it just kind of gets at if that's the case, then we have at least some value for future generations. So if we do care about future generations, the question is, well, what can we do about that?
So just a question, suppose that the timer was 1 day, 1 month, 1 year, 10 years, 100 years, or 1,000 years. Would there be different moral values associated with each of those bombs? So would it become less and less bad?
Yeah, I think there's, once again, different views on here. The standard model is to apply some discounting. And I think it makes sense to discount on probability in the sense that, well, the longer that we make this time scale, the less likely it's actually going to do anything, or maybe there's not even going to be people in the future, or the more uncertainty there is in terms of whether this thing will actually be opened at all. And so there's maybe uncertainty discounting that we could apply. And that's what to say, well, maybe those future people's lives, they matter just as much as my life matters, and the people around me today matters. But I'm going to discount how much I consider them based upon my expectation of this actually harming them or doing good to them, depending on what side you're looking at. But then I think the more controversial view is the question of, well, should we actually, on an intrinsic level, discount them more just because they are further separated from us? And this kind of gets back to the central issue of effective altruism altogether, is should we care about, even if we think of, even in terms of alleviating or helping the combat extreme poverty in the world, we're talking about people distance away, physically far away from us. And the suggestion by many more philosophers is that, well, look, just because they're further away doesn't mean that their lives matter any less. Now, for a long time, we couldn't really do much about it. Maybe you heard about something bad happening on the other side of the world, but you really didn't have a way to affect it. Or maybe people said, hey, if you give money to me, we'll bring it over there and help them out. But maybe you're doing a lot of discounting in the sense that I'm not exactly sure this is actually helping them over there. And I think if you push why a lot of people don't donate to those overseas charities, a lot of them will say something like that. Well, if I donate here, I can see the effects, and I know it's actually doing something, where I don't know what's happening over there. But in the modern world, we actually have a lot of research. We have a lot of data that actually we can have we can reduce that uncertainty for those things. So I think most people would agree, well, just because someone lives on the other side of the world doesn't mean that their lives are worth less than mine or the people that are right next to me. It's just the fact that, well, I have, in most everyday circumstances, I care about the people around for me because that's who I'm interacting with. Now, the interconnectedness of the internet but also globalization is making us live in a unique period of time where we actually can affect those people on the other side of the world. And so that's where comes into the question, well, maybe we should be doing something about that. But then the question at the same kind of concept, but for long-termism, except we're looking at time rather than space. And so on a similar level, I think we could acknowledge people in the future, if they exist, matter. So there's a parallel in terms of thinking about long-termism and future generations, in that instead of thinking about distance, physical distance, we're talking about distance in time. And so the question is, should we discount the lives of future generations based off of certainty of our impacts there? But also the question is of the values of their life as well. Should we discount that based upon, just the fact that they are further away, not just physically, but in terms of time as well? And I think for many effective altruists, things like time and physical distance aren't ultimately what matters. What matters is whether you can actually make a difference, make the world a better place. And where the big debate for long-termists versus near-termists in the effective altruist community is, I think, on the solvability front, where on one side, you're saying, look, here are things that we can do to help other people today on the other side of the world. Whereas for the long-termists, they'll say, well, sure, but if we look at the pure scale of the people that potentially could be in suffering or that we could improve, the vast majority of those people live in the future. And even if there's a small chance of some small things we can do to improve their lives or reduce the risk of catastrophes, that has such a large scaling factor that it perhaps should account for the levels of uncertainty that we have there. I think in reality that, so there's, you could say, soft long-termism, and there's also strong long-termism in the sense that some say, well, look, yes, we care about future generations, such as, trying to make the climate better in terms of climate change, or try to reduce the likelihood of a nuclear exchange. And so if there are ways that we can improve the future generations, then great. But you can care about the future generations, but also care about the generations that are alive today, and do a little bit of both. And even those that are writing books on long-termism, many of them are still also donating money to these high-impact charities that are addressing current-day problems as well.
So one of the issues that we face as a generation that no other generation has really faced is the potential benefits of AI and its potential catastrophic effects. It might be the kind of technology that will take us to the stars, that will open up, many discoveries in health and improving human welfare, or it could lead to our total annihilation. How ought we to approach it?
Great. In fact, this is in the book. This is the chapter that I talk about. Long-termism is alongside talking about AI, because this is one of those. That's the big question. All those questions that we're talking about with our long-term future seems to a lot of them go alongside with the future of AI. How artificial intelligence goes might be the direction that humanity goes in the future. And there's classic arguments there in the sense that, why do human beings dominate the rest of life on Earth? It's not because we're physically stronger than other animals. We're weaker than many of them, but it's our intelligence that we're able to outsmart them, outthink them, think many steps ahead, and outmaneuver them. If we make AI that's super intelligent, that's able to do that with us, it seems like their goals will ultimately become dominant, whatever they end up being, compared to our own goals. And this is sometimes called the alignment problem. How do we get our goals as human species aligned with this super intelligences that we potentially could be creating within our lifetimes? This is an interesting case in that this is another area that effective altruists have been working on a long time, and it's just now getting making more into the mainstream with the rise of things like generative AI and ChatGPT. But still the core questions remain. It seems like we're making a huge advancements in AI. It's causing a lot of near-term issues in the sense of we're already seeing some job loss, and there's some concern of what type of huge societal effects are we going to have in the next 5 years based upon the capabilities increase of these AI systems. And so there's a lot of challenges just in our what's happening right now. It's also in terms of justice and things of bias that could be baked into these systems, so yeah, tons of near-term issues related with AI. But if we start thinking about the long-term future of humanity, it seems hard to talk about the long-term future of humanity without talking about the role of AI in that, especially if we create artificial general intelligence, AIs that can do anything that a human could do, essentially. And then many predict that once we create that, artificial superintelligence, AI that can do far more than any individual can. What role, how does that affect the future trajectory of humanity, but also the planet at large? And I don't have any good answers for you but I do have an interesting point in that this is where a lot of the energy in the effective altruism movement currently is. But the last estimates I saw in terms of dollars, it's still a lot of, in terms of where effective altruists are donating their money, it's still a large portion of it is going to combating global poverty and the related issues to that. And a significant portion after that is going to animal issues, animal welfare, combating factory farming. Still a decent chunk on catastrophic risk, and it's growing. A large portion of that is, and there's definitely the largest amount of interest in the effective altruism community is honing in on these issues related to AI. But there's still those big questions of well, what can we actually do there to help things go better? The level of uncertainty with current AI, just what is it going to be able to do in the next year, the next 5 years? Many of the big AI companies are saying, well, artificial general intelligence that can do anything a human can do is just within reach, perhaps in the next couple of years, some are projecting. Others are saying, well, hold on. There's still some inherent constraints that we have with the generative AI models that we are creating in our current systems for making them, that it might be a little bit further off. But in any case, even if we think it's 50 years from now, that's a huge impact that it's going to have on the world. And perhaps it's something that we should take seriously. But then the big question is, well, how do we actually address it? And that's where there's a lot of uncertainty, and maybe highlights the need for more work to be done in this area.
Well, Jacob, I want to say thank you so much for a really fabulous conversation. And if you're watching this on YouTube, let us know what you think the most effective ways of changing the world are, or drop us a comment on Spotify.